Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Party Center and to this third session of What is Consciousness? I'm James B. Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the Party Center, and I will be your host for today. So basically, that means that I'm going to help you and us throughout the call. So any problems, technical or not, feel free to just drop me a message in the private chat. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone very quickly of a couple of Zoom rules. First of all, we ask participants to turn off the microphone during the presentations to ensure a good quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we hear any background noise, but it's just to ensure the good audio. At the same time, we do encourage people turning on their camera, as we believe seeing everyone's faces and reactions creates a nice, inclusive educational environment. During the Q&A and discussion, to ask a question, you can either use the raise your hand function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen under reactions, or otherwise, if you can't find it, you can just physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, I'll call you out and you can ask your question. During the questions, though, one thing I do have to ask is to make sure that you're not speaking over each other, so just allow everyone to be respectful and allow the person finish talking, so also we can hear them better. Finally, all sessions are recorded for archival purposes, but also for you all. As always, the recording will be uploaded to Vimeo about 3 days after the session, so you should receive the link to this session by Monday. And now to begin this session, let me introduce our speaker for today, Roderick May. Roderick is a good friend and a recurring presenter here at the Party Center and is currently working at the University of Essex, where he is professor in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytical Studies and the director of the Center for Myth Studies. Today, Roderick will be talking about the mundane and mystical, a pantheistic perspective on C.G. Jung's late thoughts of consciousness, ego, and self. The session will be structured with Roderick giving about 50-minute presentation, and then we'll see if we need a break. Otherwise, we'll move over to discussion. And with that, I'll pass it straight over to you, Roderick. Very welcome.
Thank you very much, James, for that introduction, and thank you to you and Eleanor and Maureen for inviting me to, and Shantina for inviting me to present here again. I'm going to share my screen. Let me just do that. So can I just get a thumbs up that that's worked? Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the mundane and mystical, a panentheistic perspective on C.G. Jung's late thoughts about consciousness, ego, and self. And the talk I'm going to give is sort of based on a chapter that's in this recently published book, Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism, which I would heartily recommend to anyone. It's available now, not too expensive, lots of very interesting material in there. The starting point for what I'm going to say is that Carl Jung is extraordinarily open, one of the most sort of open of thinkers to the possibility of extraordinary experiences, paranormal experiences, mystical experiences, and so on. From the earliest part of his career right up to the end, he investigated a whole range of phenomena, spiritualistic, psychical research kinds of phenomena, all strange things. He's entirely open to being surprised by various kinds of experiences, and he published numerous works on it, from his doctoral dissertation, various essays on spiritualism, right up to the end of his life, where he published a book on flying saucers, and he even developed concepts in order to try and make sense of these extraordinary phenomena, his concept of synchronicity. However, he there was one set of experiences that he seemed to have a bit of a reservation about accepting, what have been called introvertive mystical experiences. And I'll just briefly explain what they are. The terms extrovertive and introvertive mystical experiences were, were coined by, or became known through the work of Walter Stace, through a book that he published, Mysticism and Philosophy, in the 1960s. And he distinguishes in this book between two different sort of types of, basic types of mystical experience. And he differentiates them in this way. He says the extrovertive type is the extroverted mystic, using his physical senses, perceives the multiplicity of external material objects, the sea, the sky, the houses, the trees, mystically transfigured, so that the one, or the unity, shines through them. The introverted mystic, on the contrary, seeks, by deliberately shutting off the senses, by obliterating from consciousness the entire multiplicity of sensations, images, and thoughts, to plunge into the depths of his own ego. There, in that darkness and silence, he alleges that he perceives the one and is united with it, not as a unity seen through a multiplicity, as in the extrovertive experience, but as the wholly naked one, devoid of any plurality whatsoever. So, so this kind of experience, introverted mystical experience, it also refers to as the experience of pure consciousness. And he gives a range of characteristics of what constitutes an introverted mystical experience in a bit more detail than just in that description. And I'll just list these characteristics because I'm going to be referring to them a little bit later. Some of these characteristics are common to extrovertive and introverted mystical states, and they include a sense of objectivity and reality, very powerful sense that what's experienced is real, very strong positive affect of bliss or related emotions, a feeling of the sacred, the quality of paradoxicality, and the difficulty explaining the experience, and ineffability, difficulty articulating or describing what has been experienced. Now, in addition to these characteristics, which he thought were common to introverted and extroverted, he thought there were some characteristics that were distinctive to the introverted type of mystical states. And these were, above all, most importantly, this sort of fundamental unitary consciousness, this experience of being, as described in the previous quote, related to the one which is also experienced as a void, a sense of pure consciousness, characterized by non-spatiality and non-temporality, and involving a radical transformation from an ordinary to a unitive sense of self. So that's how he understood introverted mystical experiences in a sort of analytical way. And what I want to discuss is whether Jung's psychology can make sense of those kinds of experiences, because as we'll see, there's some question about that. So just to begin, I'll just briefly introduce what Jung has to say about consciousness and the ego. So this is what he said in 1921 in the definitions that he wrote, added to his book on psychological types. He described consciousness as in a variety of ways, but as the relation of psychic contents to the ego, insofar as this relation is perceived as such by the ego. Relations to the ego that are not perceived as such are unconscious. So for Jung, consciousness depended on the ego. He also said that consciousness is the function or activity which maintains the relation of psychic contents to the ego. So it depends on the ego and also maintains the relation with the ego, of psychic contents to the ego. And he stressed that consciousness is not identical with the psyche. The psyche is something vaster, because the psyche as a whole represents the totality of all psychic contents, and these are not necessarily all directly connected with the ego. So that's Jung's definition of consciousness in 1921. And as for the ego, he describes this as a complex of ideas which constitutes the center of my field of consciousness and appears to possess a high degree of continuity and identity. So that sort of normal sense of I that we have and that we carry with us through the day. The ego complex, he also refers to the ego as an ego complex, is as much a content as a condition of consciousness. For a psychic element, he says, is conscious to me only insofar as it is related to my ego complex. So, so the ego is, for something to be conscious, it has to be related to the ego complex. The ego complex, or the ego, is a condition of consciousness for Jung. But he then adds, in as much as the ego is only the center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche. He makes that point again, being merely one complex among other complexes. And therefore, I distinguish between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my total psyche, which also includes the unconscious. So this is Jung's sort of basic understanding of consciousness and the ego published in 1921. And this, I think, led to him having doubts about the possibility of the kind of introverted mystical experience that we just saw Walter Stace describing. And this is exemplified nowhere more clearly than in some of Jung's writings about Eastern spiritual traditions. And in one of, I think this is from his commentary on the Tibetan book of the Great Liberation, he comments as follows. He says, to us, i.e. people in the West, in Europe, consciousness is inconceivable without an ego. It is equated with the relation of contents to an ego, as we've just seen. If there is no ego, there is nobody to be conscious of anything. The ego is therefore indispensable to the conscious process. Here's the problem. The Eastern mind, however, he says, has no difficulty in conceiving of a consciousness without an ego. Consciousness is deemed capable of transcending its ego condition. Indeed, in its higher forms, the ego disappears altogether. Such an egoless mental condition can only be unconscious to us, for the simple reason that there would be nobody to witness it. So, so here he's making clear that that he thinks that the Eastern traditions are claiming for consciousness, pure consciousness, without any ego, to be a possibility, whereas he thinks that is not a possibility. And this, given his very important point, given the wide incidence of claims in support of the Eastern tradition, and in fact, not only in the East, but even in Western thought, that these kinds of introverted mystical experiences, these egoless experiences, are possible, they're reported. So, so we need to understand, in a sense, what's going on. Because if introverted mystical experience, or experiences of pure consciousness, are imageless and egoless, as claimed by the Eastern traditions and by Stace, then Jung cannot account for them, because you know, at least in his model, his earlier psychological model, mystical experience is archetypal, and archetypal experience is always expressed in images, symbols, content. And also, and even perhaps even more importantly, for Jung, the ego is necessary for consciousness. So without the ego, there can be no consciousness. So for him, the sort of states described by the Eastern traditions were states of unconsciousness, and as such, not especially desirable. So that was Jung's situation. Sorry, I'll reverse that. That was Jung's position in 1939, that quote from the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, his commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. But 5 years later, he experienced a near-death experience with some accompanied by some mystical visions. And this seems to have resulted in a change in his position. So I'll just sort of briefly describe what his experience was. So it occurred in February 1944, when he was in his 69th year. He broke his foot, and then whilst he was laid up in hospital, he suffered some complications, had a heart attack, and then had this near-death experience, during which he found himself to be floating 1,000 miles above the earth, over Ceylon, or what's now Sri Lanka. He underwent, he says, a painful process in which he was stripped of all his earthly attachments and was about to enter a stone temple on a meteorite where he would discover the meaning of his life, when he was called back to the earth by the spirit of his doctor. Over several nights, whilst recovering in hospital, he experienced a series of further visions in which he felt himself to be in the womb of the universe. And he witnessed, participated in, or in some way was the mystery of the conjunction, expressed in Jewish mystical or Kabbalistic terms as the marriage of Tiferet and Malkut, or he also says the marriage of Rabbi Simon ben Yochai's wedding in the afterlife. In Christian terms as the marriage of the Lamb, and in Greek mythological terms as the consummation of the sacred marriage, the hieroskamos of Zeus and Hera. And he described these visions as extremely strange, the most tremendous things I've ever experienced, and utterly real. So this is what Jung experienced in 1944. And I think if one looks at the details of Jung's experience, he described this in chapter 10 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. If one looks in more detail at his experiences, you can find that all the characteristics that Walter Stace finds, uses to characterize introverted mystical states are present quite clearly, or reasonably clearly, in Jung's account. And I'll just go through them, starting first of all with the ones which are common to extroverted and introverted mystical states. First of all, that the experience had a sense of objectivity and reality. Jung says it was not a product of imagination. The visions and experiences, he says, were utterly real. There was nothing subjective about them. They all had a quality of absolute objectivity. So he's describing something that, to his mind, was pretty real and so on. And he's somebody who knew a bit about imagination and subjectivity. They had strong positive effects. He says it was as if I were in an ecstasy filled with the highest possible feeling of happiness. Quite unequivocal again. There was a feeling of the sacred. The hospital room, he says, was filled with a pneuma of inexpressible sanctity. And the paradoxicality was also evident. I mean, there are a number of examples of this, and this is just one. He says, the experience gave me a feeling of extreme poverty, but at the same time of great fullness. So there are other sort of paradoxical statements in his account. And also, he's quite explicit about the ineffability, even if that sounds slightly paradoxical itself. He says, this cannot be described, whilst doing a great job of describing it after a fashion. He says, this cannot be described. It is far too wonderful. So all the characteristics that are common to extroverted and introverted mystical experiences can be found in it. So too can the characteristics specific to introverted mystical states. So for example, the unitary consciousness, the sense of the one, the void, pure consciousness, is most evident when Jung says, describing a state which he seems to imply happened more than once. He says, I felt as though I were floating in space, as though I were safe in the womb of the universe, in a tremendous void, you know, in this sort of emptiness, as it were. And non-spatiality and non-temporality, that idea of the tremendous void already sort of expresses that idea of non-spatiality. And explicitly in relation to non-temporality, he says, we shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which present, past, and future are one. And as regards the radical transformation from an ordinary to a unitive sense of self, I mean, there are various stages in this, but perhaps the one that is most apt in relation to introvertive experiences, when he says that he or one in such experiences, one is interwoven into an indescribable whole. One is interwoven into a whole and yet observes it with complete objectivity. Again, you can see the paradoxicality in a sense in that statement. So it appears that Jung had all these experiences, had an experience that satisfied all the characteristics of stasis, introvertive, mystical experience. So in a sense, he had an introvertive mystical experience himself. And then the question arises of whether this sort of affected him or had any impact on his theorizing. I mean, his definitions of consciousness and ego from 1921 and his statements doubting the possibility of introverted mystical experiences from 1939 all preceded his mystical near-death experience of 1944. And it's interesting that he says, as part of his account of this experience, I would never have imagined any such experience was possible. So he's admitting that prior to experiencing it, he didn't have he didn't need the concepts to experience it because he didn't think such experiences were possible, but he'd had an experience that went beyond what he had been able to conceive or imagine. So the question then arises of whether whether Jung's theory post 1944 shows how such experiences can be imaginable. In other words, does he have a way after 1944 of accounting for such experiences? And there are, you know, good grounds or resources to draw on in trying to explore that, because many of his most important works, Psychology of the Transference, On the Nature of the Psyche, Ion, Answer to Job, Synchronicity and A-Causal Connecting Principle, Mysterium Conjunctionis, major works, were all published after this experience. And one can see involved in those works, and in some of the ways which I shall pick out in a moment, that he developed richer formulations of a number of notions, such as the archetype, where he came to see it as distinguished between the archetype as such and the archetypal image, the process of individuation, which he gave a sort of culminating expression of in Mysterium Conjunctionis, the concept of the self, which he provided an extraordinary phenomenology of in both in Ion and in Mysterium Conjunctionis. Many interesting points about the relationship between the self and the ego, and of course he wrote about synchronicity explicitly and introduced very late this idea of a unitary reality, or the unus mundus, although that did reflect ideas that he'd articulated earlier as well. So the question is, you know, in all this material and these modifications, can they be used to make sense of his experience? So he describes his visions as part of a complete part of a completed individuation. It's a very rare phrase in Jung to talk about a completed individuation, but he does call it part of a completed individuation. And perhaps it's worth just briefly sort of just sketching out what Jung's model of individuation was. I mean, in a nutshell, it's becoming a unique self through the ongoing synthesis of consciousness and the unconscious. And he articulated this process in a variety of ways. and I'll just sort of give a kind of summary of it here. So he, for Jung, I mean, psychological development begins in childhood and early adulthood by a person's developing and strengthening an ego in order to deal with the forces that assail one from the social world and without and the psychic world within. Such an ego is inevitably one-sided because it's been forced by the pressures of its inner and outer environments to develop and thereby make conscious some potentialities at the expense of others that therefore remain unconscious. But in Jung's understanding, the unconscious has an innate drive toward expressing itself as a whole. So an opposition is set up between consciousness, centered on the ego, and the unconscious. From the unconscious, contents emerge spontaneously, for example, in the form of dreams, fantasies, symptoms, and acausal convergences of events, in order to compensate and regulate consciousness in the interests of greater overall realization of the unconscious. And that process of encounter between the ego and the unconscious, which can be facilitated by psychotherapy and the deployment of techniques such as dream interpretation, transference analysis, and active imagination. This is marked by the appearance of certain typical themes or problems that demand to be integrated and made conscious. And these typical themes, problems, or as Jung called them, archetypes, needing to be encountered and integrated with the ego, include, above all, the dark side of one's personality, the shadow, and the contrasexual element of one's personality, the anima or animus. And then when a sufficient level of integration has been achieved between ego consciousness and these archetypes, there can emerge, Jung says, a new center of the psyche, a center that is no longer one only of consciousness, as was the ego, but of both consciousness and the unconscious. And this new center is what Jung called the self. The self is potentially there from the beginning as a kind of unconscious wholeness, but the aim of individuation is to realize it consciously. This, Jung says, is an extremely arduous, lifelong task, and it's full of pitfalls, not least the dangers of either the ego becoming excessively assimilated by the self, or the self becoming excessively assimilated by the ego, both of which would result in pathological conditions such as psychosis or inflation. But conscious wholeness, Jung wrote more favorably, consists, and now I'm quoting, in a successful union of ego and self so that both preserve their intrinsic qualities. So that's from On the Nature of the Psyche. So that's Jung's basic model of individuation. And the concept of the self, that is the sort of the goal of it, as it were, is he characterizes it as the center of the psyche as a whole. He talks about it as the archetype of orientation and meaning, and also, very importantly, as the archetype of wholeness. And it's symbolized in a variety of ways, for example, by mandalas or the idea of conjoined opposites or deities. And here are a few examples of Jung's own mandalas that he included in his Red Book, which sort of reflect his own sort of engagement with this process of realization of the self, some of his better known and most important mandalas. So that's sort of Jung's model, and the concept of the self is in fact the key to understanding mystical experience in Jung's framework, not least because his late accounts of the self reflect all the characteristics of introverted mysticism. So this concept of the self also exhibits in the way in which Jung describes its phenomenology all these characteristics that Jung that Stace attributed to introvertive mystical experience, and that we've seen Jung himself referring to or implicitly using in his description of his own mystical experience. And I'll just very briefly sort of indicate this. So the idea of objectivity and reality is there when Jung talks about the objectivity of the psyche. He talks the strong positive effect. How he talks about how realization of the self through a symbol. In this expression was used in particular in by Wolfgang Pauli when he was had his vision of the world clock. This gave him, he says, an impression of the most sublime harmony, very powerful feeling. The archetype of the self is always associated with powerful numinous experiences. Jung says the self is absolutely paradoxical. He uses the word ineffability to describe it. It's impossible to fully describe. He also uses the word indescribable or you know, and so on, inarticulable. It brings us, he says, into the realm of the ineffable. And then those are the qualities that are shared by extroverted and introverted experience, but even those that are more typical, more specific to the introverted mystical experience are also exhibited by the concept of the self. It has this unitiveness expressed, for example, when Jung talks about the ultimate unity of all archetypes, as well as of the multiplicity of the phenomenal world, you know, experience of the self as characterized by in that way in Mysterium Conjunctionis. And he talks in a letter and elsewhere about the mandala having an empty center. This sort of very core of this symbol of the self has this emptiness, this voidness. Non-spatiality and non-temporality are you know, one can find him describing the self in terms evocative of these qualities, where he, for example, he talks about the sort of not exactly non-spatiality, but sort of ruptured spatiality, when he talks about the self as smaller than small, bigger than big. It's an attempt to express non-spatiality. And he talks about how experience of the self can result in feelings of eternity and immortality. And then when one thinks of how the concept of synchronicity is sort of inextricably bound up with the notion of the self, then the non-spatiality and non-temporality of synchronistic experiences also sort of come into the frame. And as for the transformation from an ordinary sense of self to a unitive sense of self, I mean, this is sort of explicit in the very sort of idea of the emergence of the self. There's a shift from to a center of personality which is essentially different from the ego. And Jung says it's comparable to the unio mystica, Tao, Samadhi, Satori, these terms that are used in Western and Eastern mystical traditions to describe a sort of a sense of ultimate unity. So the concept of the self for Jung has this sort of intrinsically mystical character to it. But the question still remains of whether Jung thinks the self is experienceable other than as an archetypal image. As we saw earlier, he distinguishes between the archetype as such, the archetype sort of in itself, which he generally says cannot be directly known or experienced, and the archetypal image, which is what we do know and experience, and of which there can be many images relating to any archetype, like sort of themes on a or like variations on a ground theme. And so that being the case, that only the archetypal image and not the archetype as such can be experienced, this suggests that the self can be experienced symbolically as an archetypal image, but not as such or in itself. However, Jung's account of individuation in terms of Gerhard Dorn's 3 conjunctions culminates in an experience of unitary unitary reality, what Dawn calls the unus mundus, and this seems this sort of very late account of individuation, culminating account of individuation in his last major work, seems to take us to the point where Jung is saying that the archetype as such can be experienced. And I'll just sort of briefly just elaborate on that. I mean, Dawn was a 16th century alchemist whom Jung studied in considerable depth. He took the book on the boat with him when he traveled to India. And he cites Dawn's 3 conjunctions in the final chapter called the conjunction in Mysterium Conjunctionis. And the 3 conjunctions in a nutshell are, the first one is the unio mentalis, which consists of, this is very concise, but a separation of the psyche from the body and uniting it with spirit. So it creates a sort of a mental unity through sort of disciplining the body and the emotions and so on. It creates this sort of inner mental union. But that then creates the problem of the body and the world of the body being, as it were, cut off from this mental union. And the problem of addressing that is the second conjunction, which Dawn calls the Kylon, the heaven. So it's the achieving of a heavenly state in which the united psyche spirit is reunited with the body. I mean, that puts it very simply, but actually, it almost, that's a kind of a lifetime's work in itself to work on that. And only when the psyche spirit has been reunited with the body does it become possible, Jung says, following Dawn, to experience the third conjunction, which is the unio mystica, the uniting of the united body, psyche, and spirit with the one world, the archetypal world of potential, the unus mundus. And just to sort of, emphasize that Jung does actually think that this is possible to experience. Here is what he says in Mysterium Conjunctionis, having just described this third conjunction, the uniting of the self with unus mundus. He says, "Not unnaturally, we are at a loss to see how a psychic experience of this kind, for such it evidently was," these are my emphases, "can be formulated as a rational concept. Undoubtedly, it was meant as the essence of perfection and universality, and as such, it characterized an experience of similar proportions. We could compare this only with the ineffable mystery of the unio mystica, or Tao, or the content of samadhi, or the experience of Satori and Zen, which would bring us to the realm of the ineffable and of extreme subjectivity, where all the criteria of reason fail. Remarkably enough," he says, "this experience is an empirical one, and insofar as there are unanimous testimonies from the East and West alike, both from the present and from the distant past, which confirm its unsurpassable subjective significance." So in the point at which he's writing this, 1955, 1956, he published it, he's now saying that that it is possible to experience the unio mystica. And it's, given that he uses the word, the term Mysterium Conjunctionis to describe his own mystical experience, it's clear that I think that he's referring to that, or he's got that in his own experience in mind. So, he's now saying that it is possible for there to be this experience, but the question remains of whether the self can be consciously experienced without the ego, because how does it possible to have this experience, basically? Jung seems to reject that the self is innately conscious and self-illuminating, because that would in one way account for this kind of experience. And that's the typical strategy in a lot of Eastern thought, if you like, that the ego is a sort of this sort of entity that needs to be stilled or aligned or even eliminated, and that once that happens, the already innately conscious and self-illuminated self then is just there, as it were. Jung doesn't seem to take that route, even though his colleague Erich Neumann sort of recommended that sort of a position to him. Jung explicitly rejects that, and we'll return to think about why he might have done that. But he also thinks that the ego, also rejects rather, that the ego is absent even in introvertive mystical experience. So even in this experience where everything seems to have gone, he sort of rejects that the ego is absent insofar as that experience, which he seems to think that he himself did experience. As far as that is an experience, he thinks the ego in some sense was present, and we'll have to think about how that can be. For Jung, the ego is certainly decentered in mystical experiences in order for these to be experiences of the self. So it disappears from view, but he insists that it remains present as an integral part of the self that is the subject of mystical experience, including of introvertive mystical experience. The ego, Jung implies, or is that which, when it is integrated into the self through the process of individuation, makes the self conscious. It's that which enables the previously unconscious self, the self that has not yet been realized in a person and remains unconscious. It's that which enables it to be consciously realized. So just like to sort of indicate provide a few hints of Jung's thought moving in the direction of that thought. And I think for the later Jung, the self, when he talks about it in relation to the ego, seems to be understood as a holistic concept that, as it were, includes the rest of the psyche, specifically the ego and the archetypes, the shadow, anima, animus, and collective unconscious generally, as its parts. Here are some sort of statements of Jung's that sort of point in this direction. I mean, the first one points to how in his later work he saw a closer relationship between the self and ego than he had done in his earlier work. He says, the more numerous and the more significant the unconscious contents which are assimilated to the ego, i.e., worked on, integrated through individuation, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self, even though this approximation, he admits, must be a never-ending process. So there's a greater rapprochement between the ego and the self. He talks about the contents of the collective unconscious as being integrated the integrated contents as being parts of the self. It's quite explicit about that. And in relation to the ego, he says this, by definition, is subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part to the whole. So it's a part that gets enfolded in the whole. And the ego, he says, can also serve as the exponent of the self. So it's that part which, in a sense, can stand for the self, almost like as an image of the self. He described it as an essential part of the self that can be used pars pro toto, as part that stands for the whole when the significance of consciousness is borne in mind. So he's even saying here that the ego sometimes can be used interchangeably with the self if in certain contexts. So he's attaching quite a lot of importance to the ego, and he's got a much closer sense of the relationship between the ego and the self than he had in his earlier work. But the question still remains of why Jung prefers this sort of idea of a holistic conception of the self as integrating the parts to the idea of an inherently conscious self, which was recommended to him by Neumann. And I think if we want to sort of explore that, it can be useful to look at Jung's implicit metaphysics, which I'm going to talk about in relation to certain theological possibilities, and in relation in particular to this concept of panentheism. I can only go into this to a limited extent here, but I have written about it more extensively elsewhere, and the references are in that chapter that I referred to earlier in the book that that includes it. But anyway, panentheism is the belief or the doctrine that the divine, that God includes and interpenetrates the universe while being more than it. It's a generic definition derived from study of lots of authors who'd written about panentheism, finds that it can be characterized in terms of three basic propositions. First, that God is not separate from the cosmos. Second, that God is affected by the cosmos. Very important, affected by the cosmos. And third, that God is more than the cosmos. Another way of putting this is to say that the relationship between God and the world is not one of strict separation and transcendence, as it is in classical theism, or of strict identity and immanence, as it is in pantheism, but of mutual coherence and harmony between transcendence and immanence. So just to sort of put this another way, another visual way in relation, I'll show you this insurance schedule of different possible ways in which the divine and the world can be related. And I don't want to go through it in detail, but just to indicate that you can see how panentheism, presupposes that there is a divine reality, and in panentheism, the divine reality is not separate from the world, and that differentiates it from classical theism. In classical theism, as in mainstream Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the divine is considered to be ontologically quite different from the world and separate from the world. Also, in panentheism, the divine reality is affected by the world in a way which in classical theism it's not considered to be. But panentheism is also at the same time more than the world, just as in classical theism, but different from pantheism. So that's how panentheism is distinguished from pantheism. In pantheism, God and the world are identical. In panentheism, God, as it were, is not separate from the world, but also is more than the world. So, that was just an aim to give a little extra clarity, and you can see other possible options and how panentheism is distinct from those. Obviously, I've set it up so that panentheism gets all the ticks. So, how does this relate to Jung's work? Well, if you make the equations which Jung makes, that the unconscious can be seen as, can be sort of functionally related to the concept of God, then you find the panentheistic structure informing his work, and statements he makes sort of have this sort of panentheistic implication. So, to take the first one, that the divine is not separate from the world, this is reflected in Jung's work by the idea that the unconscious, or the archetype, or the self, if one wants to use those terms, is not separate from consciousness. The unconscious is not separate from consciousness. The archetype is not separate from the archetypal image. The self is not separate from the ego. There's not a fundamental ontological difference between these things. In terms of Jung's own writing about God, this comes from Answer to Job, where he says it was only quite late that we realized, or rather are beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore, last but not least, man. Couldn't be a more explicit statement of non-separation. As for the divines being affected by the world, in Jung's thought, the unconscious can be affected by consciousness. The archetype can be affected by the archetypal image. The self can be affected by the ego. In theological terms, in answer to Job, Jung writes that the encounter with the creator changes the creature. That's what the whole of Jung's answer to Job, in a sense, is about. And then the idea of the divine being more than the world. The unconscious or the archetype or the self is more than consciousness. The unconscious is more than consciousness. The archetype is more than any particular archetypal image. The self is more than the ego. And he concludes answer to Job with this statement, where he says, even the enlightened person remains what he is, and is never more than his own limited ego before the one who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky. So there's also that more than, very, very explicit there. So there's a lot more one could say about why Jung's, why panentheism can be seen as an implicit metaphysics of Jung's. Implicit because Jung generally disavows doing metaphysics, but you can't get away from it, as he himself acknowledges in relation to other people's work. But I think in identifying panentheism as Jung's implicit metaphysics is quite helpful for our present problem, for the reason that as we've seen, the unconscious or the self is not separate from, is affected by, and is more than consciousness and the ego. And Jung's psychology thereby balances a sense of transcendence, the unconscious and the self, and immanence, consciousness and ego. There's a balancing of transcendence and immanence in Jung's work. So in panentheistic thought, part of the idea is that God needs the world, or needs a world, not necessarily this world. It could be another contingent world, but needs a contingent world in order to achieve realization. That's part of the sort of theology, if you like, of panentheism. And so, similarly, microcosmically, in Jung's thought, the self needs the ego in order to achieve realization. Ego performs, as it were, an analogous function to the world in panentheistic thought. So you could say that without the ego as a part of the self would remain in potentia, unrealized, just as in panentheistic metaphysics, God would remain unrealized without the world. And this brings us to the question of, for Jung, of the cosmogonic significance, if you like, of the ego. Jung makes, so in his late work, in Mysterium Conjunctionis in particular, he makes some very interesting statements about the ego, which highlight its importance in his thought and for his sense of the significance of human life. He describes the ego as a dark body from which our consciousness issues. He describes it more philosophically, if you like, as a relatively constant personification of the unconscious itself. So it's a personification of the unconscious, and then even more sort of suggestively as the Schopenhauerian mirror in which the unconscious becomes aware of its own face. So the ego is, as it were, the sort of the mirror in which the unconscious sees itself, just as in panentheistic thought, the world is, as it were, the mirror in which the divine becomes aware of the divine's self. And you can see this sort of thought of the sort of cosmogonic significance of the ego expressed very clearly in the same paragraph. Jung goes on to say, all the worlds that have ever existed before man were physically there, but they were a nameless happening. not a definite actuality. For there did not yet exist that minimal concentration of the psychic factor, which was also present, to speak the word that outweighed the whole of creation. That is the world, and this is I. That was the first morning of the world, the first sunrise after the primal darkness, when that incoherently conscious complex, the ego, the son of the darkness, knowingly sundered subject and object, and thus precipitated the world and itself into definite existence, giving it and itself a voice and a name. And you may remember similar passages in Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he talks in similar kinds of terms. This comes from Mysterium Conjunctionis. So the view that the ego introduces consciousness into creation, which is what Jung seems to think it does here. He says later in a letter to Erich Neumann, in which he was discussing why he didn't like the idea of an inherent consciousness, the self being inherently conscious. The role that's played by ego in introducing consciousness into creation, Jung thinks, endows humanity with a cosmogonic significance, gives our life meaning, basically. So this is why I think Jung was, didn't want to surrender this idea of the importance of the ego. So to conclude, for Jung, the transcendent pole of mystical experience, what Stace called introverted mysticism, involving forms of consciousness that were contentless and egoless, was not more important than the immanent pole of extroverted mysticism, in which the divine can manifest itself in and through creation. The extrovertive was equally important for Jung. He wasn't prioritizing introverted mysticism. For Stace, that introverted mysticism was, as it were, a higher kind. Other writers on mysticism don't necessarily agree with that, and it seems clear here that Jung didn't necessarily agree with that. So in Jung's view, immanence is balanced with transcendence. And you can see this in each of the ways in which Jung framed the ultimate concern of his life. He framed it in a variety of ways. One way, he says, was about whether or not we are related to anything infinite, he says. And he says that in knowing ourselves to be unique in our personal combination, i.e. unique individual selves, individuated selves, that is ultimately limited, knowing ourselves to be limited, we possess the capacity for becoming conscious of the infinite, but only then. So in other words, our limited human nature is not sort of irrelevant or something to discard or whatever. It's actually essential to our realizing or knowing that we are connected to something infinite. Another way in which he characterized this sort of ultimate concern of his life was in terms of, he says, the relationship between the here and the hereafter. And in relation to this, it's interesting that that when he developed a sort of mythology, if you like, or cosmology of the afterlife, he emphasized that those the dead, who were in the boundlessness of the hereafter, in the eternal realm, are dependent on the living for receiving answers to their questions. That is, they're dependent on those who have survived them and exist in a world of change. So again, those in eternity, if you like, and in a state of boundlessness, depend on, have a need for those who are immersed in the world of change. Another way in which he expressed his ultimate concern was precisely that sort of myth, if you like, the panentheistic myth that I just sort of outlined, how humanity's reflecting consciousness enables the creator to become conscious of his creation. So this is another sort of sense of the myth that Jung evolved for himself over the course of his life and wrote about, particularly at the end of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And then finally, the whole sort of pattern of Jung's life is governed by this concept of wholeness and the sort of development towards realization of wholeness. And he says of the experience of ultimate wholeness, this sort of unity of the individuated self, the integrated spirit, psyche, and body with the unus mundus, that such an experience includes all the attributes of introverted mystical experience, or he implies that it includes all the attributes of introverted mystical experience, but also, he says, the multiplicity of the phenomenal world. So, you know, the phenomenal world, the world of experience, the world of transience and of change is important in that total, in that sort of great unity, as it were. So he sees that not as something that is totally transcendent or wholly transcendent, but something that is also immanent, something that's balanced with immanence. So that's where I'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much, Roderick, for that great presentation. It was really, really great how you managed to basically link consciousness, but put in relation to the whole rather than just talking about consciousness, which was very, very interesting. With that, I don't know if Shantina, you have the chair of our event. Don't know if you want to have say a few words. You're just muted at the moment.
Thank you very much, Roderick, for a beautiful presentation. And you gave us like quite thorough picture of how Jung understood the theme of ego, self, and consciousness. Can I ask you what you relate most to, or where are you in this picture?
Yeah, I find I have a lot of sympathy for a sort of a panentheistic sort of picture, if you like, in which one can sort of fully acknowledge and fully sort of credit the you know, what people claim to have experienced, you know, in mystical experiences. I think you know you know, a lot of what people say is you know, there's no reason to doubt that they've experienced something that they're trying to articulate, and I think that should be kind of honoured and try to be understood and try to find a place for it in our thinking. At the same time, I think it's important to value the sort of as the mundane of my title, you know, the sort of the you know, to see this as being infusing everything, you know, the sort of the you know, maybe we're not experiencing it all the time, but potentially, you know, the world that we experience is not one that should be rejected in search for extraordinary mystical states, but rather those extraordinary mystical states and the sort of the nitty-gritty of our everyday world are both parts of one reality that equally need to be affirmed, and that's a sort of view that I feel quite you know, that I feel quite a lot of sympathy for. So that's a partial answer to your question.
Thank you. I'm reminded of the Zen saying, before enlightenment, cutting wood and fetching water from the well. After enlightenment, cutting wood and fetching water from the well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think very nice sayings. Yeah.
Thank you, Roderick.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank
It's
you.
a more concise way of putting it than my talk, I have to say. Anyway.
Right. So, Roderick, how do you feel? Would you like to have a small break, or do you want to dive into Q&A straight up?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to dive in, actually. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's open it up. As I said before, to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which can be found under reactions. Otherwise, physically raise your hand, or if you're feeling shy, you can just ask your question in the chat, and I'll read it out for you. We already have some hands raised, so I'll call on Gary.
All right. Well, thank you, and thank you for that talk. I enjoyed it very, very much. And I just wanted to make a couple comments. One was when you were talking about Jung's position about consciousness, so the ego and consciousness, the necessity for the ego. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anyone home to be conscious of anything. That's rather like Husserl, isn't it? Consciousness is intentional. There must be something that we are conscious of. You can't have consciousness per se. It's must be consciousness of something. Though I guess the Eastern traditions are saying that's not necessarily true. I don't know if Jung read much of Husserl. My impression is that he stopped at Kant. Oh well, he read Schopenhauer for fun, or Nietzsche. But you're saying his metaphysics in terms of his, it seems he kind of stopped at Kant. So I don't know if he ever read Husserl. I think he had some unkind words about Heidegger somewhere. I don't remember exactly where, but there are some things. But the other thing I wanted to say is that it struck me that there are what we call mystical experiences that aren't visionary in the way, but I would characterize Jung's as sort of visionary experiences. And you can have ones that the content is really no different than the content of everyday, mundane, but it's seen from a slightly different kind of angle. So, William James, his famous experience with nitrous oxide, which he tried in order to understand Hegel, he says, and he suggested everyone else do the same thing. He says it was basically an expansion of what he knew. It was kind of but more and more and more of it in increasing ranges of distant fact. So it wasn't anything supernatural or visionary in the sort of experiences that Jung is talking about. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is we start to talk about these things and we sort of have to, I would rather not do this, but we sort of have to fine tune it because, you could have a mystical experience where it's not visionary. I would say what James had is sort of noetic, or it's what Buck called cosmic consciousness, but we don't use that term so much anymore because sort of Timothy Leary got hold of it and made it a little disreputable. But so it's just that kind of distinction, because I don't think Jung never talks about that sort of thing. It's always sort of a visionary kind of experience, and rightly so, because that's where he was going. But he doesn't. It's not that aha kind of, or suddenly you see something and you recognize its significance in a greater pattern and an increasing range of that, rather than you're having a particular kind of symbolic via positiva kind of experience. So, but in any case, I just want to mention those and thank you very much for your talk.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, first of all, on Husserl, I don't think that Jung read Husserl. I don't know that I've got no evidence that he did, but there has been work on Jung and phenomenology, which is it sort of tried to connect some of what he said to Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and that tradition. I'm thinking in particular of a book by Roger Brooke called Jung and Phenomenology. So the connections have been sort of teased out, and there are quite a lot of people working with Jung who attach a lot of importance to phenomenology, and Jung himself not having read Husserl, probably not. Nevertheless, characterized himself as a phenomenologist. He meant sort of, he was drawing the term from Kant, wasn't he? As regards the sort of non-visionary kinds of experiences, there's an interesting sort of categorization in a recent work by one of the editors of the book in which my paper appears.
Oh.
A different book by that person, Paul Marshall, who's a great scholar of mysticism. Actually, I highly recommend his works. But he makes a distinction between three kinds of experiences, and I'm not sure if I'll try and remember what they are. But he talks about I think they're this worldly, otherworldly, and no worldly experiences. You know, the no worldly ones are the sort of ones where all sort of content disappears. I suppose a kind of the extreme introvertive kinds of experience.
Sort of the cloud of unknowing.
Yeah, the cloud of unknowing.
Meister Eckhart, that school. Yes.
Yeah, the sort of other worldly would be those that are, you know, there is content, but as you say, visionary content, which is not, you know, the content might be based on things that one's experienced or knows from, you know, from one's world, but it's not, one's clearly not in a normal environment. And probably that would apply to Jung's vision. I mean, whether or not he was literally floating 1,000 miles above Ceylon, you know, or Sri Lanka, you know, certainly one thinks that when he was suspended in space, watching the, you know, sort of Zeus and Hera copulating on Mount Ida, that probably wasn't a sort of physical, you know, probably wasn't the real world at that point. That was, you know, but clearly it was drawn from his reading of Homer, you know, so it was a material that was expressing the symbolically the idea of the mysterium conjunctionis, this sort of sacred marriage, as it were. But then I wonder whether Jung whether these other kinds of experiences, the this worldly ones, which, as you say, involve transformations, if you like, of the content of you know, of this world, are not also part of Jung's experience. I mean, in his description of his experience, he sees his hospital room, for example, in a way in which it's kind of transfigured, but it's still clearly his hospital room. He sees the nurse who brings him his food in the evening, transfigured. You know, she seems to be a sort of, you know, bringing him kosher dishes and so on, and seems to have some sort of symbolic significance and so on. But it's clearly the nurse, you know, he's seeing her in a different way. So there is a sort of a different perception of something that's happening in his reality. And then outside of you know, this particular set of visions, near-death visions, I think some of the things he says about synchronicity suggests that, I mean, he calls synchronicity in various places a sort of mystical consciousness, like being in Tao. And you know, and he's implying that you're seeing reality pretty much as it is, but you're seeing connections within it, meaning within it, in a way that is, you know, radically different from ordinary perception. And he's got some lovely statements, you know, about that.
I mean, if I could just, I don't want to take up too much time. In that context, I would say when he talks about the transcendent function, when people have risen up above something that they were seeing in one way, seeming insoluble, and then suddenly they see it from a slightly different angle or perspective, and it's no longer a problem.
Yeah.
So it hasn't changed itself, but their perspective on it has changed. And then he talks about that's linked to opening up new possibilities and potentialities and all that kind of thing. I think in that context, I mean, I relate that to sort of like Maslow's peak experiences and things of that sort. Or even when Proust has the Madeleine, you know, tasting the Madeleine, suddenly he sees something that he knew as a fact, but suddenly it becomes transformed into something else. So thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thanks for the question.
Thank you for your comments, Gary, and I'm looking forward to your talk later in this series. For the next question, we'll go to Andrew.
Hello. I'm amazingly grateful. I'm not an academic. I couldn't possibly have read Jung, and you've explained things to me which really have helped me in my own argument between my ego and myself and whatever. So thank you. I just wanted to say, for those people who are not Jewish, that what you were saying about this ineffable thing, or what Jung is saying, is very Jewish, in as much as the word for God is 4 letters, Yud, He, Vav, He, and that is the root of the verb to be. That is, it's before, now, and after. It's eternal, it's non-temporal, and it's ineffable, which is what he's talking about. And the central prayer of Judaism that you have to have on the front door and have it between your eyes and teach it to your children is that this Yud, He, Vav, He, which if you tried to say it would be like Jehovah or Yahweh, this eternalness you should love with all your heart, with all your might, and with all your soul. So what Judaism is saying is, if you can actually be in touch with that ineffable wholeness, then in that case you will behave as part of me, which is God. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to preach, but I'm just saying that it was there like 5,000 years ago. And what's amazing is he's articulated it in modern terms, and it's amazing. I'm not very religious. I might become religious now, but thank you anyway.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those comments. I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, part of the visions that Jung has, quite an important part of them is you know, the Jewish element within it, the sort of Kabbalistic content of the visions. You know, that he sees the mystery of the conjunction in terms of the marriage of Malkuth and Tiferet, this from this sort of Kabbalistic tree of life, and also the sort of sacred marriage of Yochai, what was it, of Simon ben Yochai, in the afterlife. You know, so this sort of and Jung became very interested in Kabbalistic and Hasidic thoughts at the end of his life, later in his life, and even said in I think it was in either an 80th or a 70th birthday interview, that the whole of his psychology had been prefigured by one of the early sort of you know, masters of the Hasidic movement. So there are interesting connections there. He said, you know, it's almost like it's all there, you know. He sort of acknowledged that.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm 78. Maybe I'll get on with it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. I apologize for those who are waiting. I can see Beverly has a question for you, and she's going to be in her presentation tomorrow.
All right. It's just more of a comment from within the consulting room, that very often the self first turns up as what the person feels is missing. So it's like the presence of an absence, some part of oneself that is not really in alignment. So one is almost immediately in the process that keeps on going toward the self through that experience of the missing piece. And just one other comment, Roderick, hi, hello,
Hi.
nice to
Hi.
see you.
Likewise.
I've enjoyed many a presentation with Roderick. The shadow is not just the dark side. It's that which cannot be integrated yet. And so it's the way Jung describes it, it's that which is overvalued as well as that which is undervalued. And so very often you get these very powerful, complete figures in dreams because the overvalued is left unconscious. So I think we have to be really careful when we talk about the shadow in terms of which direction it goes, the over or undervalued.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's I sort of oversimplified. It's true that, but that's a really nice formulation actually. I like that formulation of what cannot be integrated.
And what's so interesting about it is in terms of where one stands in relation to the light, one shadow can be larger than oneself or smaller than oneself. So I like that very much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank
you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I like, so that's very helpful about the presence of absence as well as being, you know, yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
Beverly, and looking forward to tomorrow. we'll take the next question from Gary.
This was a tremendous talk, Roderick. I'm wondering whether we can see Jung as a residual nominalist, in that, you know, he kind of, I mean, and you made this reference to him versus Neumann, right? The idea that the self is unconscious, I mean, that's problematic, I think. I mean, there's Mark Soames, you know, who's talking about the conscious id. I mean, the idea that the self itself is conscious, as is all of nature, right? All of the universe is conscious, which, you know, comes back to the unity and God's participation in the universe. And that what for the human being is unique is the possibility of meta-consciousness, which is where the ego fits in, that we become aware of our experience and we begin to try to describe it and communicate it to others using language. And, you know, this idea of individuation, I think, can be viewed very much in the way that Kurt Goldstein talks about self-actualization, and Maslow picked that up. The idea that the self, which is one's full real potential, is actualized into physicality, is actualized into, you know, the actuality of material existence, you know, through this mysterious process of transformation of the self, which is the totality of one's potential, and the ego, which is, you know, the language mediated self-awareness, if you will, that, you know, the limited self-awareness that we have through language, but that the underlying reality is fundamentally relational, you know, deeply relational, as opposed to material, which flips everything on its head. It's no longer I think, therefore I am. It's more like I am, therefore I have the possibility of thinking. Right? I mean, I am an experiencing organism, just like every other living organism, just like the universe. But what's unique about the human is that I can actually begin to contemplate what it means to be conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering about, you know, that what you said about this kind of distinction between Neumann's approach, where he claims that the self is conscious, right, versus Jung's insistence that the self, you know, is unconscious until it is made conscious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when you introduce the notion of the metaconscious, I think the difference between that you might perceive between what I said and what you're saying maybe gets attenuated a bit, I think, because I mean, I don't think when Jung is saying that the self is unconscious that he's saying it's not. I mean, it's potentially conscious, and he's not saying that he's not saying it's sort of, you know, inert material or anything like this. You know, so you know, and he seemed to subscribe to the view that that, you know, things that were material had a sort of, you know, the matter and psyche were not separable ultimately, you know, in the sense that they or in the sense that they were expressions of the same underlying unitary reality. So the potential for consciousness is not absent, I don't think Jung would say, from in some sense, in that sort of primary sense of, you know, of some sort of psychicity, if you like, from anything. I
would tend to frame it as like the potential for reportability, right?
Okay.
The potential that for the ability to express the experience linguistically so that it can communicate it in language.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I mean, in relation to the sort of disagreement with Neumann, which is interesting because Neumann sort of pressed Jung on these points, and Jung sort of, in the end, he sort of said, well, you know, he didn't sort of argue against Neumann in sort of explicitly after he wrote his one or two letters. He sort of closed the matter off by saying that his Jung statements were not based just on sort of arguments. They were based on sort of bitter personal experience. And I don't know exactly what he's referring to, but it's probably it's, you know, his own struggle with religion and you know, the concept of God and so on. So it never really gets resolved, the discussion. It kind of gets dropped, as it were, the dispute with Neumann. But Jung is quite insistent. You know, he wants there to be a function for the human contribution, for human consciousness, for the activity of the human in the realization of the sort of underlying reality in some way. So I mean, we've sort of corresponded a bit about these things, and you've shared a lot of your material with me, and I know that that there are these issues go far and deep and and are quite difficult to resolve concisely. But thank you for alerting me to some of those problems.
I would like to ask Roderick a question. Sorry for jumping in, but since I don't know how to raise my hand as a co-host. Okay, well, the question is, was Jung aware of Spinoza, and what relationship there might be or there might not be between their visions?
Yes, I mean, Jung was aware of Spinoza, and there's a nice paper actually by Joe Cambray about who looks at all, Joseph Cambray, who looks at all of the references that Jung makes to Spinoza. Jung is generally kind of not very positive about Spinoza. I think he kind of misunderstands him as being too rationalistic, if I recall. But there is something very important. There's a very important connection between Spinoza's work and Jung's work, which has been elaborated in particular recently by Harold Atmanspacher, when he's developed the sort of understanding of mind-matter relations in terms of dual aspect monism. The idea of like Spinoza thought of God and nature as being, well, God as having two attributes, or I've forgotten the sort of the effectively the mental and the physical. I've forgotten Spinoza's terms for them off the top of my head, but that idea that that there are these two sort of expressions of an underlying reality, of a deeper underlying reality, has been sort of picked up. Well, it was picked up by Jung and Pauli, who developed these sort of ideas to some extent, and then further extrapolated and applied empirically, actually, by Harold Atmanspacher in a lot of his work, which is really quite a fascinating sort of extension of that idea. But I'm told that I have a PhD student actually who's working on Jung and Spinoza at the moment, and he sort of thinks that Jung, that Spinoza was not so much a dual aspect monist or proto dual aspect monist and so on. So I'm waiting to have all my ideas on that overturned by him. But it's a very interesting relation, I think, Spinoza and Jung, which has not been explored enough. Did you have something else in mind in particular in relation?
Well, I sensed a strong affinity there in some sense. Yeah. Couldn't say anything more specific than that.
Yeah.
This notion of Deus sive natura seems like
very
close to Jung's
way. Well, I mean, I sort of elaborated, I made a case for, which I've made in more detail elsewhere, for Jung as an implicit panentheist. And normally Spinoza is taken as the prototypical pantheist, the one who sort of fully identified God with nature, because of that phrase that you just mentioned, Deus sive natura. But you know, there are readings of Spinoza that would see him not so much as you know, as much a panentheist, or there are elements that are more panentheistic in Spinoza than pantheistic, in the sense that, for example, when he talks about the attributes of whatever the two attributes are, he says there are an infinite number of possible attributes, and these are just the two that we know, which implies that the divine is more than is manifesting, or is at least is experienceable by humans. So from our point of view, at least, a panentheistic perspective would be, you know, more implied than a pantheistic one. But you know, so yeah, there are lots of interesting things to explore there, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Roderick.
Thank you, Shantana, for that comment or question. I'm just gonna go now to Lyndon and Rocky, as they have their hand up for a while now.
Yes, thank you, James, and thank you, Roderick. Just an absolutely lovely talk. And as you answered questions, you sort of answered my question, but I'd like to ask it in terms of a story. In the future, when to a future generation, when we tell the story of a man who went to the hospital for a few days, and from this experience wound up writing a number of books that, especially when taken all together, are quite a standalone event in the Western world. So my question is, taken as a story and the completeness of the story, is there anything left for us to do?
Oh, I like to think there are a few things to do. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, for one, I mean, just in relation, I mean, I think there's lots to do, but just in relation to what Jung's legacy, I think there are enormous amounts of things to do, which is one of which is to try and make sense of it all, because it's not all written in crystalline terms, if I can put it that way. So there's a lot of sort of understanding to do, lots of lots of ideas thrown out which need to be elaborated, developed, tested, and so on. I mean, there's endless amounts to do. I mean, just to say, in relation to, you know, him going into hospital, having the experience, and then coming out and writing the books. I mean, the books, many of them were already, you know, in process before his heart attack, has to be said. I think the experience of the heart attack, the near-death experience, the mystical experiences, I think were both, you know, what he'd been reading and studying and working on before that, both made those experiences possible, and his work prepared him for them, and they fed into the imagery of them. But the experiences themselves also, as it were, allowed him to at least sort of unbutton a few more, to, you know, unbutton himself a bit more and speak a bit more freely, and express formulation. He says explicitly that the experience enabled him to formulate ideas more freely and creatively than he might have done it beforehand. So
yes, and in a certain way, he did this for all of us.
Well, yeah, I guess
all of the Western world.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I would hope so. I think so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Rocky, and we'll go back to Beverly.
Thank you. I'd just like to add something in here in terms of, Roderick, what you were describing in terms of the conjunction and the mysterious conjunction, that when Jung is talking in terms of when it's in the psychology of the transference, which is where it's more relevant to what goes on in an individual, the soul leaving the body is because the body has become too concrete in its attachments and the way things are. And so the soul, which we think about in one way as the capacity to grant value, has to detach itself and decaffect, so to speak, from those attachments. It goes up and conjoins with spirit, which is the dynamic. And only when the capacity to grant value is connected with a dynamic sensibility can it risk going back into the body, and instead of being just attachments, it's experience. Then after that, the mysterious conjunction is that that kind of individual who's gone through that can risk participating in the idea of the one world without losing a sense of one's own individuality. And that's the mysterious aspect of the conjunction. The sort of more integrated individual with that whole unus mundus, the world as it was in the imagination of God idea. So that's a really important piece in terms of any kind of process of individuation. And along with that is a whole section that Jung writes about how in the Christian mythology, Christ starts in heaven, comes down to earth, and goes back up to heaven. And in the alchemical mythology, it's that Mercurius is on the earth, goes up to get a higher perspective, but has to come back down into experience. So they're just such fascinating parallels that are all drawn and differences in that whole section. And many people just don't refer to it. So Roderick, I'm very grateful that you did and do.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I've been meaning for a long time to sort of go back to psychology of the transference and read through that to get a more fleshed out picture of what Jung's talking about in Mysterium Conjunctionis. Because originally it was intended to be part of the same work, wasn't it? And he sort of cut it off because it was, I don't know, it was getting too big or whatever. But but I mean that your the sort of your sort of clinical insight and understanding is really helpful here, and that's thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Beverly, again. And the next question will come from Sonia.
Hi, hello, Professor.
Hi, Sonia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the brilliant talk. I look forward to the recording, actually, to, I'm sure it's the kind of talk we need to listen a few times. I was just mentioning, just as a side note, an anecdote, actually, while you were talking, there was a football game with the Danish and like the Denmark against Finland, and there's a football player who collapsed and got really close to death. So just as a strange coincidence, but it's very interesting. He actually got reanimated. But apart from that, everything you described about Jung's near-death experience really reminded me about all the stories and testimonies I've heard about psychedelic experiences as related by individuals who have lived mystical experiences. And also I immediately recalled Jordan Peterson's reference from Jung, where he quotes Jung saying that we have to be aware of unearned wisdom. And I imagine that he must have said that at times when psychedelics were becoming quite big, so towards the end of his life. So I was wondering if you had an idea whether it was something that he said after his near-death experience, and if you then think that he lived an experience of earned wisdom through his near-death experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I think Jung, Jung's wisdom was earned not just by his near-death experience. He put in 69 years, or he's put in quite a few decades of clinical work and sort of knocking about the world, as it were, before that. So I think he'd but your point about he does say about psychedelics that he's kind of wary of activating the unconscious, which obviously psychedelic drugs can do in ways that where one cannot then integrate what's been activated, you know. So whether he said that, made those statements before or after, I don't know the chronology on that, but I imagine he would have said it before and after equally, actually, because it just seems consonant with the kind of position he takes on these things. Yeah, but it is to the very interesting point. Your comment about the football player having a sort of kind of near-death experience or whatever, we don't know quite whether they had visions involved in it, also resonates. I mean, there's anybody who's following the French Open, tomorrow you've got Tsitsipas playing Djokovic in the men's final, and Tsitsipas he had a near-death experience when he was a number of years ago, and he attributes to that his kind of fearlessness on the court and so on. So it can near death. I don't think it was a visionary experience, but it was a powerful sense of that he was going to die, and then some realizations that came with that, which he's then carried with him. Whether it'll be enough to unseat, you know, Djokovic or not will be another question. But anyway, there we go.
Thank you for that, Sonia. We don't have any hands up yet, so if anyone has a question, feel free to do so. Niels.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, it's very interesting to hear things from that side of things. I personally have experienced spiritual experiences, but I take it as something universal for everyone. So I don't go for putting labels on it or not. So how can one say that it is a universal experience that we all have at times? What do you think about that?
Well,
we tend to put labels on things.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I would think probably. I mean, certainly anybody could have them. Whether everybody does, I don't know, but certainly I think anybody could. And there have been sort of, you know, empirical collections. You know, people have collected experiences of mystical experiences or and similar such things, and you know, they come from everybody. You know, not just people who are actively pursuing these kind of areas, but basically from anybody. Very often from people who are completely expecting this sort of thing. So I mean, I would think yes, it could. You know, it could.
Yes, because often the experiences we have is a form of revelation, but that's only meant for us to fit into a situation which is now.
Yeah,
that's my experience. And if we think about it, if there is one creative mind of it all, then we would expect everything to be universal.
Yeah.
That's my way of thinking, but
I mean, I suppose also the particular content of any of these experiences, as you say, is very specific to the individual. I didn't talk about the content really of Jung's experiences very much. We talked a little bit about the Kabbalistic aspect of it, but there's so many other interesting aspects of it. I mean, one that could be mentioned is his the Indian aspect, you know, that he finds himself floating over Ceylon, you know, and or Sri Lanka, and he had this sort of problematic relationship with Indian thought, or you know, the sort of spiritual traditions there. So there may be some interesting connections in relation to that. There's you know, in fact, there are lots of details about his experience and his account, which, if one were in a position to, would be really interesting to explore in relation to, you know, the complexity of his life. But you know, I mean, it could be endless.
Is this gathered somewhere so it's easy to get these stories or whatever?
Which stories? I mean,
Yes, they're obviously written in many different books. So,
yeah, I mean, Jung's account is in his memoir,
yeah.
Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in chapter 10 of that. The book I would recommend if you want to look into, you know, the study of mystical experience might be Paul Marshall's books. You know, his first one, Mystical Experiences of the Natural World, published by Oxford University Press in 2005, would be a, you know, there's lots of interesting material in there.
Yes,
very intelligently analysed.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And the Alistair Hardy Centre in what used to be in Oxford, it's now I think based somewhere in Wales, but in Lampeter I think, and they've published collections of material, you know, of experiences. But I think there are quite a lot. If one looks, there are loads of accounts of such material.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Niels. We have a few hands up. We'll go to Paul next.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. On the question of whether the self is conscious, I wonder what you think of the following viewpoint. If we see the self as the author of dreams whose purpose is to compensate for the limitations of the ego, then the self could be seen as having a consciousness of the world that transcends that of the ego. But in order for that consciousness of the self to influence or to be known in the world, it is dependent on the consciousness of the ego.
Yeah, that's a nice formulation. Yeah, I mean, how you relate? I mean, in a way, that's it's. I mean, are you presenting that as an idea that you think is different from what Jung is saying, or is more aligned with
I'm
what?
just wondering if you. It's how I would understand Jung, and in particular, the idea, his understanding of dreams, that the dream which displays this consciousness that the ego needs to receive, that consciousness is the consciousness of the self. So I'm just wondering if you agree with that, or if that's how you understand it.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a kind of knowledge. I mean, he refers to a sort of what he calls an absolute knowledge of the unconscious, by which he means not knowledge of everything necessarily, but knowledge that is not bound or restricted by you know, the normal ways in which we acquire knowledge through the senses, and seems to think that unconsciously one can gain access to such knowledge. What you seem to be saying is that there is that because of the, you know, the knowledge emerges, as it were, in a way that is relevant as a compensation to some conscious state, that it's that there is some intentionality behind it, which suggests that there is a consciousness of the kind that Jung seems to be questioning. Is that right?
Well, I certainly would feel that that is the key thing, the intentionality, that the goal indeed of the information communicated by the self via dreams is the individuation of the ego. That seems to be the goal directedness of dreams. And when you experience that on a week by week basis, it really is as if one is communicating with an entity that is aware of everything that's going on, both in the mind of the dreamer during his quotidian experience, but in the external relationships of the dreamer. So it's this more comprehensive consciousness, the type of thing that could be accessed via the I Ching, for instance. It does seem to speak of a consciousness of that is very related to the here and now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's you know, the particular way in which Jung's using the term consciousness in the sense that I mean, he clearly doesn't deny that sort of purposiveness is there. In fact, that's, you know, a major part of what he writes about. But it doesn't become conscious until it becomes conscious, as it were.
Yes, yes.
But I think the position that you're saying is very similar to the criticism that Neumann made. You know, that the fact that, you know, that such experiences can happen, doesn't that already imply a sort of consciousness on the part of, you know, the God, if you like.
Yeah, and as you say, the paradox may be that this is doesn't really have a huge influence in the world without the consciousness of an experiencer of it. You know, that the transcendent consciousness of the self is paradoxically dependent on the limited consciousness of the human being to find a full expression in the world.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Paul, we'll see if we can fit both questions in, just because we only have about 5 minutes left, but we'll go next to Nancy. Oh, you're just muted.
I'd like to kind of build on that last question. Could you see synchronistic events as being a coming into consciousness of the self?
You mean more specifically than, for example, dreams or?
Yes. Yes, I mean, it's really coming into reality, hitting reality full on.
Well, there's certainly something very powerful and distinctive about synchronistic experiences, because they do seem to you know, exhibit you know, this sort of strange psychophysical quality. You know, that they're both sort of you know, they're not sort of purely mental events, and they're not purely physical events. They somehow have the characteristic of both, and you know, so they have this sort of deep kind of liminality and sort of kind of relationality about them, and they seem to point towards some sort of unity of the material and the mental. So there's something very powerful and strange about them, and they do express a lot of the qualities that I enumerated that you can find in Jung related to the self, that are you know, also relatable to this idea of introverted mysticism, or mysticism more generally, actually. You know, and I think also the concept of synchronicity is, as I sort of said in passing during the talk, you know, I think it's totally embedded in the notion of the self. I think even before Jung extracted the notion of the self, the notion of synchronicity for sort of specific formulation and treatment, I think it was kind of implicit in his thinking, you know, because a sort of deep relation between, you know, inner and outer, between mind and matter, seems to have been there really right from very early on in his work, before he was talking about synchronicity. And one could say that a lot of his concepts actually were there in germ before he managed to formulate them, or before he either had the knowledge, or the opportunity, or the need to articulate them fully. So I mean, there's a very nice sort of paper actually by Harold Coward, who wrote about synchronicity and the self, and argues that basically that the two concepts are kind of imply each other almost, or certainly that the self implies synchronicity. He says that writing in relation to Jung's interest in Taoism and Chinese thought and so on. I mean, it's interesting that if you look at a concept like Tao, Jung applies the concept of Tao both as an equivalent to the self and as an equivalent to synchronicity in different contexts, and sometimes even in the same context or very closely related contexts. So I think there's certainly a lot to think about in your question. Yeah, and probably the answer is yes. Short answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy,
yeah, nice to you.
for that question. Unfortunately, we only have 2 minutes left, so sorry, Beverly, but I think we have to start closing the session. Roderick, do you have any last remarks before we close?
Well, just to thank everyone for their questions. Well, first of all, thank everyone for their attention, actually, and for their questions, which have been very helpful to me to, you know, good questions really sort of expose threads in one's thought that you know that you haven't really realized are not tied up properly. So it's very helpful. Not that they necessarily should be tied up, but at any rate, shows you where things are still needing work. So it's been very helpful, and yeah, and thank you again for inviting me.
Great, thank you, Roderick, and I mean, thank you for your presentation. It was a fantastic presentation, but also for your attention as well, who's managed to dedicate a whole hour to Q&A. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
One thing I did want to share with you all is I know synchronicity has been mentioned a few times during our Q&A, and we on our YouTube channel we have a video of Richard Berengarten, a poet who's a friend of ours, who did a reading of a few of his selected poems on synchronicity, and they are introduced by Roderick. So I'm just going to share it with you in case you're interested. The poems are very beautiful, and Roderick's introduction was very, very nice as well. So yes, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for interacting in the chat. Thank you for all your questions. Before we go, I'd just like to remind everyone that of tomorrow's session, the 4th session of What is Consciousness, which is entitled Emotion, Synchronicity, and Surprise, with Beverly Zabriskie, who's here with us. And it starts same time as today, so it's 5 p.m. if you're in England. So I hope to see you all tomorrow. If you have anything that you would like to communicate to us, you can visit our website in the contact us section, or you could just write us on social media, or even an email directly to us at james@parcenter.com to contact me, or eleanor@parcenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon here at the Parcenter. Bye-bye.